He invited her to his engagement gala not because he missed her, but because he wanted a room full of witnesses when he made her feel small one last time. The invitation arrived on a Thursday afternoon, tucked inside a cream envelope so thick it felt less like paper and more like a verdict. Emily Carter found it beneath the brass mail slot of her apartment in Portland, right between an electric bill and a coupon for a grocery store she no longer visited. For a moment, she simply looked at it. The silver lettering caught the pale winter light from the window. Daniel Whitmore and Vanessa Blake, together with their families, request the pleasure of your company. The words were polite. The meaning was not. Daniel knew exactly what he was doing. He knew she would recognize the Langford Grand Hotel embossed at the bottom, the same hotel where, years ago, they had once pressed their faces to the glass and promised each other they would stay there someday when life became kinder. Back then, Daniel had been driving a used sedan with a cracked windshield and wearing the same navy suit to every interview. Back then, Emily had believed love meant standing beside someone before the world learned his name. Now he had chosen that same hotel as the stage for his new life, and he had made sure she received a front-row seat. Emily stood in her small kitchen with the invitation in her hand while the kettle whispered on the stove. Outside, rain traced slow lines down the window. Inside, everything was still. She did not tear the card. She did not laugh. She did not cry. She only read the handwritten note tucked behind the formal invitation, a short line in Daniel's sharp, familiar script. Hope you can come and see how far I've moved on. There it was, clean and cruel, dressed up as confidence. He wanted her to walk into a ballroom filled with their old friends, his new business contacts, Vanessa's polished circle, and people who only remembered Emily as the wife who had disappeared after the divorce. He wanted her to see the red satin dress, the 5-carat ring, the champagne tower, the photographers, the life he believed she had been too ordinary to share. He wanted silence from her, but not the kind she chose. He wanted the silence of defeat. Emily set the card on the counter and watched a drop of rain slide down the glass until it vanished into the gray below. Her apartment was quiet, barely 700 square feet, with secondhand shelves, a worn oak table, and fabric samples stacked beside invoices. Nothing about it looked like revenge. Nothing about it looked like power. But there was order here. There was peace. There was a woman who had learned to sleep without waiting for footsteps that never came. On the counter, her phone lit up with a message from an old mutual friend asking if she had received the invitation, followed by 3 small dots that appeared, disappeared, then appeared again, as if even gossip felt embarrassed by itself. Emily did not answer. She picked up the kettle before it could scream, poured water over the coffee grounds, and let the rich scent rise through the room. Her hands were steady. That was the first thing she noticed. Not the ache, not the insult, the steadiness. She looked at Daniel's note again, then at her own reflection in the darkening window. The woman staring back at her was not the one he had left behind in a courthouse hallway 3 years ago. This woman had softer eyes, sharper boundaries, and a quietness that no longer asked to be understood. Daniel had sent an invitation because he thought he knew the ending. He imagined her arriving alone, shrinking beneath crystal chandeliers, trying to smile, while Vanessa displayed the life that had replaced her. He imagined victory would look like Emily Carter lowering her gaze. What Daniel did not know was that the Langford Grand was no longer just the place where he planned to humiliate his ex-wife. It was the place where everything he had built on arrogance was about to meet the one thing he had never respected, her name. Before Daniel Whitmore learned how to enter a room like he owned it, Emily Carter had watched him rehearse confidence in front of a bathroom mirror with a towel around his shoulders and a tie he did not yet know how to knot. Their first apartment had been on the 3rd floor of an old brick building outside Portland, with a heater that rattled through the night and a kitchen so narrow they had to turn sideways to pass each other. Daniel used to leave job rejection letters on the table like small white flags, and Emily would slide them into a drawer before making eggs on a skillet that leaned to one side. She never called it failure. She called it timing. When his car needed new brakes, she picked up weekend shifts at a design showroom. When he needed a better suit for a meeting downtown, she used the money she had saved for her own certification course and told him the course could wait. At 2 in the morning, when the city had gone quiet and the only light in the apartment came from his laptop screen, she sat beside him correcting his proposals, softening his sentences, turning his desperate ideas into language that sounded expensive. Daniel would fall asleep with his head in his hands, and Emily would keep working, one hand wrapped around a mug of cold coffee, the other moving across the keyboard as if she were stitching a future together thread by thread. She believed in him before he had proof. That was the part Daniel later forgot, or perhaps the part he needed to forget in order to become the man who could leave her without looking ashamed. The change did not happen all at once. It came slowly, in better restaurants, cleaner shoes, new friends who laughed too loudly at jokes that were not funny. It came in the way Daniel began saying my career instead of our future. It came when he stopped asking Emily what she thought before accepting invitations and started telling her what she should wear when she came along. At first, she adjusted. She bought quieter dresses, smiled through conversations about markets and luxury developments, and stood beside him while men in tailored jackets shook his hand and asked what she did. Before she could answer, Daniel often answered for her. She is creative, he would say, in the gentle tone people use when they are making something smaller. Once, at a company dinner, a senior partner praised Daniel for a proposal Emily had spent 3 nights helping him rebuild. Daniel smiled, lifted his glass, and said he had pulled it together under pressure. Emily sat beside him with a linen napkin across her lap, watching candlelight move over the silverware. She did not correct him. She told herself marriage was not a scoreboard. She told herself love did not need credit. But love, when starved of respect, begins to lose its shape. By the time Daniel received his first executive title at Langford Group, he had learned how to stand taller while making Emily feel like she was taking up too much space. He began coming home late with the clean scent of hotel lobbies on his coat. He began checking his phone face down. He began saying she would not understand certain pressures, certain rooms, certain levels of ambition. The night he asked for a divorce, the rain had sounded almost exactly like it did on the afternoon his engagement invitation arrived. He placed the papers on their dining table as if setting down a business contract. Emily looked at the signature lines, then at the man she had once stayed awake for until sunrise. She asked him only one question. Was any of it real? Daniel stared past her shoulder toward the window, where their reflections stood together and already looked divided. He did not answer. That silence told her more than cruelty ever could. 3 years later, standing in her own quiet kitchen with his invitation on the counter, Emily remembered the apartment, the old skillet, the midnight proposals, the drawer full of rejection letters. She remembered all of it without reaching for it. Daniel had not built himself alone. He had simply grown tall enough to believe he had. By 7 o'clock on Saturday night, the Langford Grand Hotel looked as if it had been polished for judgment. Warm light spilled from the arched windows onto the wet Portland sidewalk, turning every passing car into a ribbon of gold. Inside, the marble floors gleamed beneath crystal chandeliers, and the lobby smelled faintly of white lilies, expensive cologne, and rain carried in on wool coats. Emily Carter arrived 5 minutes after the first wave of guests, not late enough to seem dramatic, not early enough to stand waiting. She wore a simple ivory dress with long sleeves, pearl earrings small enough to be missed by anyone who only understood wealth when it shouted, and a camel coat folded over one arm. No diamonds, no bright lipstick, no borrowed confidence, just a quiet woman walking through a room that had been prepared to misunderstand her. At the entrance to the ballroom, a young attendant checked the guest list, paused at her name, then glanced up with the quick, uncomfortable recognition of someone who had been told more than necessary. Emily gave him a small smile. He looked relieved and stepped aside. The ballroom opened before her in a sweep of champagne light. Round tables dressed in white linen filled the room, each one crowded with crystal glasses, gold chargers, and centerpieces tall enough to make conversation difficult. At the far end, a stage had been built beneath a wall of flowers, and above it, a screen played a slow slideshow of Daniel and Vanessa smiling on beaches, balconies, and private rooftops. Every image seemed chosen to prove a point. They were successful. They were beautiful. They had won. Then Vanessa Blake saw Emily. She stood near the stage in a red satin gown, one hand resting just below the diamond on her finger, her smile blooming with the satisfaction of a person watching a trap close exactly as planned. Daniel was beside her in a black tuxedo, laughing with 2 senior executives from Langford Group. When his eyes found Emily, the laugh stayed on his face, but something behind it sharpened. He looked pleased. Not surprised, pleased. Vanessa crossed the room first, slow enough to gather attention, carrying a flute of sparkling water as if it were a prop. Emily could feel nearby conversations thinning into whispers. The old friends from Daniel's early years turned their faces halfway, pretending not to watch. A woman Emily once hosted for Thanksgiving lowered her eyes to her menu. Vanessa stopped just close enough for her perfume to arrive before her words. "Emily, you came." Her voice was sweet, but every syllable had a polished edge. "We were not sure you would feel comfortable." Emily looked at her for a brief moment, then at the ballroom behind her. "It is a beautiful venue," she said. Vanessa's smile tightened, because kindness had not been the response she wanted. She tilted her head and let her gaze travel over Emily's dress, her simple earrings, her empty left hand. "And you came alone?" The question landed softly, but it was made for the room. A few people nearby went still. Daniel had walked up by then, his hand settling at Vanessa's waist with the confidence of a man who believed the scene belonged to him. He looked Emily over as if measuring how much damage the evening had already done. "I am glad you made it," he said. "It takes courage to show up after everything." Emily heard the performance in his voice, the generous tone, the public mercy. He wanted the room to see him as gracious. He wanted her to appear smaller inside his forgiveness. Before she could answer, Vanessa touched Daniel's sleeve and laughed lightly. "We saved you a seat near the front," she said. "We did not want you to miss anything." The words drifted across the small circle of guests. Someone gave a quiet, uncertain laugh. Daniel smiled as if he had not heard it, which meant he had. Emily turned toward the table Vanessa indicated. It was close to the stage, directly beneath the screen where Daniel and Vanessa's engagement photos glowed larger than life. Her place card sat alone between two couples she barely knew. A perfect seat for exposure. A perfect seat for pity. She walked to it without hurry. The room watched, waiting for the crack, the flush, the trembling hand. Some little evidence that the invitation had found its mark. Emily pulled out the chair, placed her camel coat across the back, and sat with her spine straight. On the screen above her, Daniel kissed Vanessa's forehead in a vineyard somewhere in Napa. Around her, silverware chimed, glasses lifted, whispers moved like air through silk. Emily reached for her water glass. The rim caught the chandelier light. Her fingers stayed still. For 3 years after the divorce, Emily Carter learned how to rebuild without applause. There had been no dramatic return, no sudden fortune, no crowd waiting to admire how gracefully she survived. There was only a studio apartment with a stubborn window that stuck in the summer, a thrifted desk with one uneven leg, and mornings that began before the sun had fully lifted over Portland. She woke at 5:30 because quiet was cheaper than confidence, and at that hour the world asked less of her. Coffee brewed in a chipped ceramic pot, while she spread fabric swatches, paint cards, and invoices across the floor, turning 700 square feet into an office, a workshop, and sometimes a place to cry without being seen. Her first clients were not glamorous. A bakery in Beaverton needed new lighting, but could barely afford the fixtures. A widowed schoolteacher in Lake Oswego wanted her late husband's study changed into a reading room and apologized 3 times for the budget. A young couple in Salem asked Emily to redesign their nursery with secondhand furniture and hope. Emily took every project seriously. She measured walls with a metal tape measure that snapped against her palm. She drove through rain with rolls of wallpaper in the back seat of her aging Honda. She learned which suppliers would return calls, which contractors arrived on time, and which wealthy clients confused kindness with permission. At night, when her hands smelled faintly of paint and sawdust, she sat at her desk and taught herself the parts of business Daniel had always made sound too complicated for her. Contracts, deposits, change orders, tax forms, licensing fees. She made mistakes, corrected them, and wrote the lessons on yellow sticky notes she placed along the edge of her monitor. Charge for revisions. Get it in writing. Do not apologize for the price of your work. The first time a client wrote a check to Emily Carter Design, she held it longer than necessary before sliding it into her bag. It was not a large check. It would cover rent, gas, and part of a credit card payment. But her name sat on the payee line, clean and undeniable, and that small rectangle of paper felt more honest than every promise Daniel had ever made under soft restaurant lights. Slowly, The rooms she touched began to speak for her. The bakery doubled its morning crowd because people wanted to sit under the warm brass lamps she had chosen. The schoolteacher sent a photograph of herself reading beside a window framed in linen curtains. A boutique owner in the Pearl District recommended Emily to a hotel consultant, who recommended her to a private client, who asked if she had ever worked on luxury properties. Emily almost said no. Then she looked at the portfolio she had built from borrowed time, surfeit, and quiet refusal, and answered with the truth. Not yet, but I know how to listen to a room. That sentence changed more than she understood at the time. It carried her into spaces where marble arrived from Italy, where rugs cost more than her first car, where people discussed lighting like it was a language of power. She did not become impressed by wealth. She studied it. She learned that expensive rooms often felt empty because no one had asked what kind of life was supposed to happen inside them. She learned to notice what others missed. The chair angled away from conversation, the hallway too cold for welcome, the office designed to intimidate but not think. Her reputation grew not because she chased attention, but because her work made silence feel intentional. By the time Daniel's invitation arrived, Emily was no longer the woman who had been left with a stack of unsigned dreams. She was the woman who had signed her own contracts, paid her own rent, and walked into rooms with a tape measure in her bag and a spine made steady by every morning she had survived alone. Alexander Hayes first noticed Emily Carter because she did not try to impress him. It happened 6 months before Daniel's gala, in the private lobby of a waterfront residence overlooking the Willamette River, where the windows rose 2 stories high and the furniture looked as if it had been chosen by someone afraid of comfort. Emily had been hired by a hotel consultant to soften the space without making it look staged. She arrived in black trousers, a cream sweater, and flat shoes dusted lightly from a morning site visit. Her hair was pinned low, a pencil tucked behind one ear, and a measuring tape clipped to the side of her leatherwork bag. The client had been speaking loudly for 10 minutes about imported stone, custom glass, and the kind of art that came with certificates. Emily listened without interrupting. Then she walked to the far corner of the lobby, stood beneath a cold beam of afternoon light, and said the room did not need more expensive things. It needed a reason for people to stay. The sentence made the client blink. It made Alexander, standing near the elevator in a charcoal overcoat, look up from his phone. He had come as a silent investor, introduced only as Mr. Hayes, a man who listened more than he spoke, and whose name caused careful posture among people who knew money well enough to fear quiet money. Emily did not know who he was. That was part of what held his attention. She did not angle her body toward him. She did not raise her voice for him. She simply opened her folder, placed a revised floor plan on the long walnut table, and explained how the seating should shift 12 feet closer to the windows, how the lighting should lower by evening, how the entrance needed warmth before luxury. Her words were practical, but there was something beneath them, a respect for unseen lives moving through polished rooms. Alexander watched the others nod slowly, as if she had given them permission to understand what they had been missing. After the meeting, while the client praised the design in the vague way wealthy people praised things they wanted to claim as their own idea, Alexander waited near the elevators. Emily was packing fabric samples into her bag when he stepped closer. "You noticed the silence in the room?" he said. Emily looked up, calm but cautious. "Most rooms speak before people do," she answered. "You just have to stop telling them what they are supposed to be." For the first time that afternoon, Alexander smiled. Not the practiced smile of a man closing a deal, but something smaller, more genuine. He asked for her card. She handed it to him without asking what he needed or what he was worth. The next morning, his office called. Not for a penthouse, not for a private home, for a confidential hospitality project tied to the Langford Grand Hotel and several sister properties across the Pacific Northwest. Emily almost declined before she understood the scale. The Langford name still carried Daniel's shadow, but work had taught her not to run from rooms just because the past had once stood inside them. At their first official project meeting, Alexander reviewed her portfolio page by page. He did not flatter her. He asked sharp questions about material durability, guest flow, staffing routes, acoustics, ADA accessibility, renovation timelines, and how to make an old luxury hotel feel human without stripping away its history. Emily answered each question with the steadiness of someone who had earned her confidence in unpaid hours. When she did not know something, she said so, then explained how she would find out. Alexander respected that more than a performance. Over the next months, their work settled into a rhythm. He sent brief emails after midnight, not because he expected her to answer, but because he seemed to work when the city was asleep. She answered in the morning with annotated plans and precise notes. He never called her sweetheart, never touched her shoulder to guide her through a room, never spoke over her in meetings and then called it enthusiasm. When contractors questioned her decisions, Alexander let her answer, and when she finished, he supported the decision as final. That mattered more to Emily than flowers ever could have. He was not rescuing her. He was witnessing her competence without trying to own it. One evening, after a long walk through the unfinished ballroom of the Langford Grand, Emily stood beneath a chandelier wrapped in protective muslin and studied the space where hundreds of guests would soon gather. Alexander stood several feet away, hands in his coat pockets, watching the same room. "This hotel has a memory problem," she said. "It remembers wealth, but not welcome." Alexander turned toward her. "Then help me change what it remembers." She did not know then that Daniel would choose that very ballroom for his engagement celebration. She did not know that Vanessa would send the invitation with a smile sharp enough to cut glass. She only knew that Alexander Hayes had opened a door, and for once, the door did not lead back to who she had been. It led toward the version of herself Daniel had never stayed long enough to meet. 3 days before the gala, Emily Carter learned that Daniel Whitmore had chosen the wrong room for the right kind of humiliation. She was standing in the unfinished west corridor of the Langford Grand with a roll of revised floor plans under one arm when Alexander Hayes handed her the final event schedule. The paper was warm from the printer, clipped neatly to a black folder, and at first Emily read it the way she read every project detail, carefully, without emotion. Lighting check at 4 o'clock. Catering walkthrough at 5:15. Private security briefing at 6. Engagement reception for Daniel Whitmore and Vanessa Blake at 7. Executive announcement at 8:30. Her eyes stopped there, not because the words surprised her, but because they aligned too perfectly. Alexander noticed the small pause. "Do you know him?" he asked. Emily did not look away from the schedule. "I was married to him," she said. The corridor seemed to become quieter, though nothing in it had changed. A worker rolled a cart of folded linens past them. Somewhere below, a vacuum hummed across carpet. Alexander did not react with pity, curiosity, or the sharp pleasure people sometimes took in discovering old wounds. He simply waited, giving her the dignity of deciding how much truth the moment deserved. Emily lowered the page. "He invited me," she said. "Not because he wanted me there." Alexander's expression shifted only slightly, but enough. He understood rooms. He understood power. He understood that invitations could be weapons when placed in the right hands. For a moment, Emily expected him to offer to cancel the event, move the announcement, or shield her from the discomfort Daniel had arranged so carefully. He did none of those things. Instead, he looked down the corridor toward the ballroom where the chandeliers were being unwrapped, one crystal strand at a time. "The ownership transfer is already signed," he said. "The board will be present. The staff has been briefed. Tomorrow the press release goes out to partners, but Saturday night will be the first public acknowledgement." Then he turned back to her. "Your role in the Langford Revival project will be announced as planned." Emily looked through the open ballroom doors. The same room Daniel had chosen as a stage for her embarrassment now held ladders, covered chairs, trays of glassware, and the faint scent of fresh flowers waiting in cold storage. The space did not look cruel in daylight. It looked unfinished. Maybe that was why she felt calm. Daniel thought he had selected a room that remembered only his rise and her absence. He had no idea she had spent months walking its floors before the carpet was cleaned, choosing the wall sconces, correcting the seating flow, softening the entry so guests would feel welcomed before they understood the price of anything around them. He had no idea that the ballroom already knew her footsteps. That evening, Emily went home and placed Daniel's invitation beside Alexander's schedule on her oak table. 2 pieces of paper, one designed to reduce her, one quietly confirming what she had built. She made tea and let both documents sit beneath the soft kitchen light while rain tapped against the window. For a long time, she did nothing. Then she opened her closet. There were no gowns meant to compete with Vanessa Blake, no sequins, no borrowed drama. Emily chose an ivory dress because it fit well, because it allowed her to breathe, because it did not ask permission to be elegant. She polished her small pearl earrings with a cotton cloth. She cleaned the heels of her nude pumps. She steamed her camel coat until the fabric fell smoothly from the hanger. Every gesture was ordinary, and that was what made it powerful. She was not preparing for revenge. Revenge would have required her to build the evening around Daniel. Emily had stopped doing that years ago. She was preparing to stand where her work had already earned a place for her. On Saturday, just before leaving, she paused by the mirror near her apartment door. For a second, she saw the woman from the courthouse hallway, holding herself together while Daniel looked past her shoulder. Then the reflection changed. The woman in the mirror had calm eyes, steady hands, and no need to be chosen by the man who had mistaken devotion for weakness. Her phone buzzed once. A message from Alexander appeared on the screen. "The board is arriving. See you inside." Emily slipped the phone into her clutch, picked up the invitation Daniel had sent like a challenge, and left it on the table. She did not need to carry proof of why she belonged there. The hotel already had her name on the plans. Daniel Whitmore waited until the servers cleared the first course before stepping onto the small stage, because timing had always mattered more to him than truth. The ballroom lights softened as if obeying him, narrowing into a warm glow around the flower wall and the gold microphone stand. Conversations faded. Crystal glasses settled against white linen. Vanessa Blake lifted her chin from the front table, her red satin dress catching the light like a warning, while Daniel adjusted one cuff link and looked out over the crowd with the practiced humility of a man who had rehearsed being admired. Emily Carter sat near the front, exactly where Vanessa had placed her, beneath the glowing screen of engagement photos and beside two guests who had spoken to her only in careful fragments. Her water glass stood untouched. Her napkin lay folded across her lap. She could feel the room turning toward Daniel, then toward her, then politely away, as if everyone had been invited to witness something, but no one wanted to be caught watching too closely. Daniel began with gratitude. He thanked their families, their friends, the Langford colleagues who had supported his rise, and the people who believed in building a future with vision. His voice carried smoothly through the speakers, warm at the edges, polished in the center. Emily listened without moving. She knew that voice. She had heard earlier versions of it at the kitchen table when he was still learning how to sound important. She had once corrected its pauses, removed its desperate sentences, taught it where to breathe. Now it floated above the room as if it had built itself. Daniel turned toward Vanessa and smiled. Then he said that meeting her had shown him what it meant to stand beside someone who truly matched the life he was meant to live. A small wave of laughter and applause moved through the ballroom. It was not loud, not cruel enough to be named, but it carried exactly where he wanted it to go. Several eyes shifted toward Emily. A woman at the next table lowered her champagne flute slowly. Someone near the stage whispered behind a hand. Vanessa's smile widened, elegant and satisfied. Emily looked at the centerpiece in front of her, at the white lilies arranged so high they nearly blocked the stage from certain seats. Whoever had approved them had ignored the sight lines. She made a quiet note of it in her mind, not because it mattered now, but because noticing flaws in rooms had become easier than letting old words find soft places inside her. Daniel continued, warming to his own performance. He spoke about second chances, about leaving behind seasons that no longer served the future, about how success required the courage to choose what elevated you. None of it mentioned Emily by name. All of it pointed at her with clean hands. That had always been his talent, saying something unkind in language respectable enough to survive a dinner party. Then, with a smile that made the room lean closer, he added that tonight was more than a celebration of love. It was also the beginning of a new professional chapter. He said Langford Group was entering an exciting period, and he was honored to be in conversation for a senior role in the company's next era. The applause came quickly, especially from people who understood ambition better than sincerity. Daniel accepted it with lowered eyes, as though modesty had simply landed on him. Emily saw two board members at a table along the right wall exchange a glance. It lasted less than a second, but it told her enough. Daniel did not know what had already been decided. He did not know the ownership transfer had been signed. He did not know the man he hoped to impress was not seated at any table waiting for Daniel's speech to end. Vanessa reached for his hand when he stepped down, and he bent to kiss her cheek with the ease of a man certain the evening had tilted in his favor. As he passed Emily's table, he slowed just enough for only her to hear him over the returning murmur of the room. "You are handling this better than I expected," he said. Emily looked up at him then. Not sharply, not sadly, just fully. For one breath, Daniel's smile faltered, because there was nothing in her face for him to use. No anger to flatter him, no grief to feed him, no embarrassment to prove he had won. Only calm. He moved on before the silence could make him smaller. Vanessa watched from a few feet away, her eyes bright with curiosity and irritation, as if Emily had failed to perform the role assigned to her. The servers began pouring coffee. The screen shifted to another photograph of Daniel and Vanessa standing on a balcony above Napa Valley. Around the room, people relaxed, believing the sharpest part of the evening had passed. Emily knew it had not. At 8:28, the lights near the ballroom entrance dimmed by half, just as the revised event schedule had promised. At 8:29, the hotel manager stepped discreetly to the side doors and nodded to someone beyond them. At 8:30, the music faded until even the silverware seemed too loud. Daniel turned his head, annoyed by the interruption. Emily placed both hands lightly around her water glass and waited. At exactly 8:30, the ballroom doors opened without drama, and that was what made the room change. No music swelled. No spotlight searched. No one announced power before it arrived. Alexander Hayes simply stepped into the Langford Grand with a small group of board members behind him, dressed in a dark tailored suit and a gray tie the color of winter rain. The hotel manager straightened first. Then the senior executives near the right wall stood almost at once, their chairs whispering against the carpet. A ripple moved through the room, not loud enough to be confusion, not organized enough to be applause. Recognition traveled faster than explanation. Daniel Whitmore turned from Vanessa with irritation still on his face, and then the irritation disappeared. For a moment, he looked like a man reading a number on a bill he thought someone else was paying. Vanessa leaned closer to him and whispered something, but Daniel did not answer. His eyes were fixed on Alexander. Emily remained seated, her hands resting near the water glass, the chandelier light steady across her pearls. She had seen Alexander in unfinished rooms, in quiet sight. Meetings, beside rolled carpets and exposed wiring. She had seen him ask practical questions and wait for honest answers. But this version of him belonged to the world Daniel worshipped, and the world knew it. The master of ceremonies stepped onto the stage with a note card that trembled just enough to catch the light. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience," he said. "Tonight, before we continue the celebration, Langford Grand is honored to welcome the new chairman and principal owner of Langford Hospitality Group, Mr. Alexander Hayes." The applause began carefully, then grew as people understood they were supposed to be standing. Daniel rose too late. That small delay exposed more than panic would have. Vanessa stood beside him, her smile still present but no longer connected to her eyes. Alexander walked to the stage without rushing. He shook the master of ceremonies' hand, accepted the microphone, and looked over the ballroom as if he were reading the architecture before the faces. When his gaze passed Daniel, it did not stop. That was the first cut to Daniel's pride, though no one could name it. Alexander spoke calmly about stewardship, restoration, and the responsibility of returning warmth to places that had mistaken expense for meaning. His voice was low, but the room leaned in. He did not mention Daniel's senior role. He did not mention Daniel at all. Then Alexander turned slightly toward the center tables. "Over the past several months," he said, "one person has understood this property with unusual clarity. Not as a monument to status, but as a place where people should feel received before they feel impressed." Emily's breathing remained even, but around her, the air sharpened. Daniel glanced toward the board table, then toward the stage, then finally toward her. Slowly, understanding began to disturb his face. Alexander continued, "The Langford Revival Project will require taste, discipline, and a respect for history without being trapped by it. That is why I am pleased to announce Emily Carter as creative director for the project, effective immediately." For a second, the ballroom forgot how to respond. The silence was not empty. It was full of recalculation. Then a board member began clapping. Another joined. The applause spread, uncertain at first, then stronger as guests turned to locate the woman they had spent the evening quietly pitying. Emily stood. Her ivory dress did not glitter under the chandelier. It did not need to. She walked toward the stage with the same measured calm she had carried through every insult of the night. Past Vanessa's frozen smile, past Daniel's pale disbelief, past the tables where whispers had changed direction. When she reached the steps, Alexander came down one to meet her. He did not pull her forward or present her like a prize. He simply offered his hand, steady and respectful, as if the room were being asked to recognize what had already been true. Emily took it. The applause settled into something warmer. Daniel watched from below, motionless, his own announcement still hanging uselessly in the air. The man he had hoped would approve his future was standing beside the woman he had treated like an old chapter. And for the first time that night, Daniel understood that Emily had not arrived alone. She had arrived with the work, the name, and the quiet authority he had never believed belonged to her. Emily Carter stood beside Alexander Hayes beneath the restored chandelier, and for the first time all evening, the ballroom looked less like a place built to judge her and more like a room learning how to correct itself. The applause did not thunder. It gathered. It moved from the board table to the old friends, from the old friends to the guests who had spent the night whispering, from the guests to the servers standing discreetly near the walls. Even the sound felt different now, no longer sharp with curiosity, but warm with recognition. Emily accepted the microphone from Alexander with both hands. For one brief second, she looked out at the faces below her. Vanessa Blake stood near the front table, one hand still resting beside the diamond Daniel had given her, her smile held in place by effort alone. Daniel stood a few feet away from her, his shoulders squared too tightly, his eyes fixed on Emily as if she had become a document he should have read more carefully. Before signing away his rights, Emily could have said so many things. She could have reminded the room who corrected Daniel's first proposals, who paid bills while he chased titles, who sat alone in a courthouse hallway while he mistook silence for weakness. She could have turned one sentence into a mirror and held it up until his confidence had nowhere left to stand. But that would have made the moment about him, and Emily had already given Daniel too many years of her life. So she looked toward the board members, then toward the staff along the back wall, then finally toward the room itself, the room she had studied in dust and daylight long before it glittered for guests. "Thank you for trusting the work," she said. That was all. 5 words, spoken evenly, without decoration. Yet they landed with more force than any accusation could have. Alexander nodded once, not proudly like an owner displaying success, but respectfully, like a colleague acknowledging a truth. The applause rose again, and Emily stepped back from the microphone. She did not look at Daniel immediately. She let him feel the absence of her attention. For years, he had believed being ignored by him had been the worst thing that could happen to her. Now he understood the quieter punishment of becoming irrelevant to someone who once loved him completely. The program continued, but the evening had changed its center. Guests approached Emily with careful smiles, speaking about the hotel, the project, her vision, as though they had not spent the first half of the night measuring the empty space beside her chair. Emily answered each person with calm courtesy. She did not make them apologize. She did not need them to. Vanessa tried once to regain the room, laughing a little too brightly about how unexpected the announcement had been, but the sound faded before it reached anyone important. Daniel remained near the edge of the stage, surrounded by people who no longer knew what to say to him. His earlier speech about elevation and future now hung over him like a badly chosen decoration. When Emily finally stepped down from the stage, he moved toward her. Not quickly, not confidently, but with the strained politeness of a man searching for a door that had already closed. "Emily," he said. Her name sounded unfamiliar in his mouth, almost careful. She paused, not because he deserved the pause, but because she no longer feared what might come after it. Daniel glanced at Alexander, then back at her. "I did not know," he said. It was the closest thing to honesty he had offered all night, and still it was too small. Emily looked at him and saw the younger man in the cracked windshield sedan, the ambitious husband at the narrow kitchen table, the stranger in the courthouse hallway, the polished executive who had invited her here to feel diminished. All of them were there, layered behind his eyes. None of them had power over her anymore. "No," she said gently. You did not. She did not explain what he failed to know. She did not list what he failed to value. She simply gave him a small, peaceful smile and walked past him. Alexander waited near the ballroom doors, holding her camel coat over one arm. He did not ask what Daniel had said. He did not need to. Emily slipped into the coat, and together they stepped into the lobby, where the rain outside had softened into a silver mist over the city. Behind them, the music resumed, but it sounded distant now, like a party in someone else's life. At the entrance, Emily turned once, not toward Daniel, not toward Vanessa, but toward the hotel itself. The Langford Grand no longer felt like a memory she had to survive. It felt like a room she had helped transform. Then she walked out beneath the gold awning, her heels steady on the wet stone, her reflection moving through the glass doors without looking back. She had not come to be chosen. She had not come to be rescued. She had not come to win back the man who had mistaken her devotion for something disposable. She came to stand where her own name had carried her, and in the end, that was the victory Daniel could not touch. She did not return to be seen by him. She returned to be witnessed by the world.